Welcome to News from Neptune for the 42nd week of 2018. I'm Carl Estabrook. Our program is conceived in the spirit of Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a socialist government a century ago, who said the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. Historians consider a generation to be about 25 years, roughly the time it would take you to get to the age your parents are now. For more than a generation, our program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. I'm now the age my parents would have been when we started the program, and my eldest son is the age I was then. It's not been an encouraging 25 years. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for 3 generations. He wrote his first political article at the age of 10 on the fall of Barcelona to Franco's troops in the fraught year of 1939. We'll read a bit of Auden on September 1st, 1939, maybe. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I will try to say some true things in a Cutting Up People Alive edition of News from Neptune.
Uh-oh.
That's what the U.S. and its chief allies, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Israel, do, and we're shocked when we hear about it. Our thanks, as usual, to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. No's notes are posted on the News from Neptune Facebook page. And we will start with a list of topics from David.
Oh, you don't have a list?
I have several.
Oh, okay. Well,
I got a little list.
Well, let me just say, apropos to your introduction, it's been about 10 years since we started doing this program, and I'm 10 years older than when we started doing this program.
That's what'll get you.
Yeah, and I feel like it. So, I guess I have 4 basic topics here of a disparate nature. Okay. A couple of which are sort of recycled from last week, because I'm not satisfied with what I was able to say last week. The first one concerns this instance about the limousine crash in upstate New York, and its relationship to the FBI sting operations that the owner of the limousine service was behind over a period of the previous 15 years. Last week I mentioned a column or a blog post that Louis Project had on this issue, and an interview that Amy Goodman did, which would have been last Thursday or Friday, a week ago, Thursday or Friday, that pointed this out, that tried to make a connection between the FBI sting operation, in which the FBI agitator was a Pakistani immigrant who was put up to luring and entrapping several down and out men in upstate New York, including Albany and Newburgh, in order to set up a situation in which the FBI actually prevented a terrorist attack, which they had thought of, which they caused. And what Louis Project referred to was, in the case of the Newburgh sting, there's actually an HBO film called The Newburgh Sting, which I watched over the last week. It's available on YouTube. If you go on YouTube, you will at first appearance, you will notice that the video is over 2 hours long, but it's actually only an hour and 15-minute documentary film, which for some reason whoever put that up there restarted it and played another hour of it. So it's really not the time commitment. Don't be put off by the 2 hours or 2 hours plus that the YouTube video is. It's 1 hour and 15 minutes and very well done, and shows the nature of how these four down and out black men were entrapped by this Pakistani hustler who'd been converted by the FBI into an informant because he was basically of a criminal mentality, and so in order to work off his time, so to speak, he conducted this he was given the money and the means to conduct this operation with these African American men, which ended up in planning the fake bombing of a Jewish synagogue in a place called Riverdale, which is in the Bronx, and to add insult to injury. So what the FBI planned here was basically, promoting a kind of pardon the term race war between these, sort of stoking the already allegedly difficult relationships between blacks and Jews, and black anti-Semitism and Jewish Holocaust industry nonsense and all that kind of stuff, playing into all of these tropes. This was back in 2009. These four men ended up in prison for 15 years. So this film was made in 2013 or 2014. They'd already been in prison for 4 or 5 years, so presumably they have another, I forget, 15 or 20, I think it was 25 years, so it's presumably they have another 20 years. So anyway, what disturbed me about this, of course, was that nobody other than Louis Project or Amy Goodman, and neither of them since then, has really followed up on this. Apparently there are not going to be any repercussions in the mainstream media connecting not just this accident to the FBI sting, but this accident. The other aspect of this, of course, is that this limousine service was operating in an obviously extremely dangerous way. That will come out. That continues to come out. That will come out, and there will probably repercussions in that area. But the connection between this sort of neoliberal aspect of the deregulatory aspect of this business versus the neoconservative aspect, which is the idea that this partly is related to the war on terror. This won't be drawn unless somebody comes in some other media venue in order to do this. What Louis Project wrote in last week, which I didn't read last week, was the following: I hope some radical filmmaker can make a new film that connects the dots between the scumbags, that's Lewis, this Pakistani FBI informant, between the scumbags and entrapment operations and his homicidal limousine business. It will illustrate how FBI stings and wanton disregard for safety regulations are driven by the same deadly logic that puts the national security state and the sorry state of consumer protection on the same footing. So that's sort of my little sermon about where that's at.
I came across an article about the effects of this crash and the FBI sting and so forth of a family that went on a family outing in this limousine.
Right.
3 daughters.
It was actually four sisters.
There are 4 sisters, exactly. And 4 daughters of the family and the husbands of several of them. All left their kids with the grandparents and died in the crash. Right,
exactly.
It was a horrible description of what happened.
And really, 20 people killed. Apparently, one of the worst accidents, the worst transportation-related accident in decades, in 2010 or 10 or 15 years, including even airplane crashes. And so, and again, I mean, maybe we have to be a little bit careful about what the relationship is between this crash and the person who owned this business, and whether the limousine business in general is more the problem here rather than this particular person.
Yeah.
But the coincidence of this is too obvious not to draw these connections in this particular case.
And at least to some extent, this is another triumph of our secret political police in this country, the FBI.
Yeah.
So,
And ever since this, then during the post 9/11 period, whenever on the dozen occasions or so where you open up the paper or whatever and read about some operation was foiled, invariably, if one reads to the bottom of the article and makes a couple, looks for what you're looking for, one will find that the whole operation was planned by the FBI. That there never was any terrorist activity.
right.
In almost every case, there never was any terrorist activity that didn't have to be planned by the FBI itself. And that's a pattern that goes on over and over and over. In 2 cases with this one man, and in several cases with other people.
You're watching News from Neptune. We're talking about some of the more horrible stories in the news this week in a cutting up people edition of News from Neptune. To turn to lighter fare, finally, at least as dangerous in its way, there was a debate last night between 2 candidates for the House seat from this district, Illinois' 13th congressional district. Did you watch the debate or listen
I
to it?
did not.
Yeah,
I did not.
Neither did I.
Was it on during the Red Sox game?
Yeah, it was on during the. Okay, I'm busted. There we are. That's exactly what was going on. Going during the. So you may hear more about this as well, because if the Boston Red Sox end up playing the Los Angeles Dodgers, David's from L.A. I've spent many years in Boston. Yeah, we may have to have this out too. But in any case, there was a debate between the 2 aspirants to the local House seat, congressional seat from this area. Betsy Dirksen Londrigan and Rodney Davis, the incumbent. There is little to choose between the 2 of them, but we had an independent analysis, in a way, from our chief researcher, Dr. No, who was called by the Dirksen Londrigan campaign and urged to vote for the Democratic challenger. They called him, interestingly, they called our researcher at 4 o'clock on last Sunday afternoon. I guess their research had already shown that he was not a football fan, at least, and would be available to talk about these matters at 4 o'clock, or maybe they were hoping that they would get away with a quick encouragement to go vote for the Democrat. He writes, Betsy Dirksen Londrigan's campaign called me about 4:20 p.m. today, last Sunday, and the positions discussed were as follows. I asked, what's her position on war? This is the position on war of the Democratic candidate for this seat. Letting Londrigan's rep take this wherever they wanted to go with this to see what they do with it. She replied that she's for veterans. I'm not sure what this means. And for making sure veterans keep their health care coverage, including pre-existing conditions. She asked for me to be more specific in my questions. I replied, what's her position on ending the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the drone war, for instance? The phone rep, the person who made the call, talked to someone else on her end and ultimately had no answer. I asked, what's her position on Medicare for all? She's, quote, for Medicare, including for veterans, close quote. Then I clarified, but I'm asking about Medicare for all, single payer, universal Medicare for all. Again, no answer. Talking to someone else on their end also produced no answer. I asked, what's her position on cutting the military budget in half? There was no answer to that. I asked, what's her position on the trillions of dollars the U.S. Defense Department lost track of over the past few years? And again, the answer came back that they had no position on this. asking someone else in the room resulted in some chatter between people on her side of the call, and then they hung up on me. So that's what the Democratic challenger is doing in the upcoming election. I have alienated a number of friends and colleagues, including, I think, to some extent, David, by suggesting that it's so dangerous to give the Democrats control of the House of Representatives, the control of the Congress, when they're on this war-mad Russiagate nonsense, that one really should vote for the Republicans, bad as they are, wretched as they are, in order to keep the Democrats from gaining control of the House. And nothing I've seen in recent weeks makes me change my mind on that. I have not, I don't have any enthusiasm at all for our feckless incumbent, Rodney Davis, the Republican. But the Democratic challenger, as a member of a party which will organize the House if they get enough Democrats in the new Congress, she should not be supported, not so much on her own positions, which, as we see from Dr. No's researches, don't really amount to much at all, but on the fact that the party would organize the Congress. The Democratic Party organizing the Congress increases the chances of war, and for that very reason it should be opposed, I think. Dr. No continues, I think it's important to point out that the U.S. military has officially, as the government has admitted, lost track of trillions of dollars in the past decade or so. One of the few outlets to report on this at all is RT's Redacted Tonight news comedy show. In the incredible world of, in the literal sense, of news broadcasting in this country, Redacted Tonight has turned out to be the most interesting and serious entrant in that all too crowded field. This is money that could have been spent, the money the Pentagon has wasted and lost. This is money that could have been spent on any number of programs aimed at benefiting the public, guaranteed jobs, funding Medicare for all, and, ironically, liberating the U.S. Congress from having to raise money from the HMOs by giving the public reason to favor the very candidates now calling and visiting in pursuit of votes, like Dirksen Londrigan. Ending homelessness, as well as continuing such programs across generations. Dr. No says, I was never rude or curt with them, so I can only guess they hung up on me because I kept asking them things that didn't happen to align with their preconceived talking points. U.S. Congresspeople have no more important decisions to make than those on war and peace, as well as life-saving and life-ending decisions. It seems clear to me that they hadn't thought this through by being so ill-prepared to address such consequential issues. I tried visiting Londrigan's website and found it required a bunch of non-free JavaScript to see anything on the site. JavaScript is a common means to distribute malware, so it's not wise to run code one hasn't vetted. Running a website's JavaScript code by default is highly unwise. This is from our researcher who is an expert in these areas and notes that this is what's going on if you want to find out what the Democratic campaign really thinks. I visited her site through a proxy, which let me see the site without running its JavaScript. I don't quite know what that means, but you get the gist of it. I couldn't find anything on war or war funding. I found that Londrigan wants to, quote, save the ACA, close quote. As one interview put it, the Affordable Care Act is also known as Obamacare, hence ACA. The ACA was written by the HMOs working with the Obama administration, which sought to put another barrier in place to prevent Medicare for all from ever becoming law, and thus largely serves the interests of the HMOs. States can choose to not participate in the ACA's Medicaid expansion by law, and overall this keeps the status quo intact. HMOs ultimately determine what care we get, how much to charge for said care, and we pay regardless of the coverage. Londrigan's position suggests he's fine with keeping the HMOs in power and thus tacitly approves of their increasingly unaffordable health care over Medicare for all, which there is a bill in Congress to support, H.R. 676. Medicare for All consistently polls more favorably nationally than any HMO-driven plan, including the ACA, Obamacare, and single-payer plans around the world offer more affordable care to more people than what the U.S. currently has. Dr. No continues or concludes his observation of the Dirksen-Londrigan campaign by saying, "I'm unimpressed that her representatives know so little about such important issues of the day." This is an important point. The election across the country includes the fact that the Democrats put up a good number of ex-CIA and ex-military intelligence people to try to get a hold of those seats in Congress, and some are on the way to making it, and other places that did even sneakier things in favor of war. The best example I know is from Massachusetts, where longtime Representative Capuano, who has been a consistent anti-war voice in the House, was challenged by a Democrat. He's a Democrat. Was challenged by a young Democrat, young black female Democrat, who said she agreed with Capuano on everything except war, and ran on the basis of her being young, black, and female. A crass and effective use of identity politics to eliminate an anti-war vote in the House. And that was not lost on the Democratic organization. That's why they put this woman up to run against this anti-war vote, and they won. So what happens if we give the Democrats control of the House of Representatives is we get pro-war people, often in place of those few anti-war people in the House, like Capuano of Massachusetts. It's not a good idea, and I will vote for the Republicans in this election, wretched as he is, in order not to contribute to the Democrats getting control of the House.
Well, but a little proportion, a little context is appropriate here. What is a vote? What is an election? What is Rodney Davis?
You sound like Polonius, my friend.
Well, I mean, this is all. I mean, we're focusing on this, and this is such a small part of the picture, even in the electoral context. Not to mention the whole political context of what foreign policy is, how foreign policy does, what it does, what the role the Congress has in all that versus the Trump administration. I mean, this just seems to be so much importance putting on this one race, which doesn't necessarily sound like it's necessarily even close, and that we don't know what would happen if the Democrats control the House, whereas the Republicans will likely retain control of the Senate. It just seems like a lot of concern about something that doesn't ultimately make a whole lot of difference.
David, this is the one vote local people have to influence federal government policy for 2 years.
Right.
It's the only one we've got.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying that the election or even war turns on this vote. I am saying that the few things that we can do are exhausted by one vote for the House next month. For the question is, how should we vote? All of our good liberal friends are saying, well, of course we vote for the Democrats. Democrats are terrible, but they're the liberal party. Therefore, we vote for them. I'm saying that's wrong, that indeed across the country we should reject Democratic control of the House on the recent record. The question is which party would control the House, not whether one or the other of our feckless local candidates end up there. That's all we got.
I have less enthusiasm for the idea that the Republicans that the Democrats would be a greater evil as opposed to a marginally lesser evil. I'm not enthusiastic about a lesser evil voting in this case. If you could make the argument that the Democrats are lesser evil on the basis of climate change, on the basis of there's a contingent of them that's opposed to our support for the war in Yemen, as opposed to there's not nearly as large a Republican contingent in that context. The Iran deal and overturning the Iran deal, there's there's a few factors there, but overall, in terms of whatever is genuinely quote unquote liberal about the Democratic Party control of the House hardly gets me excited about what might happen if they were to get in. But still, we wouldn't necessarily have had a tax cut, the kind of tax cut that we had. The
paramount question is war. If the whole reason that Trump got, well, the whole reason, a large part of the reason Trump got elected is that he challenged the pro-war activities of the last administration that were going to be carried on and expanded by President Clinton. There were many other factors involved, but if we talk about what the importance of the last election was and the importance of this election, we remember that our mentor Noam Chomsky says there are in fact two major political questions before us. One you just mentioned, global warming, and the other, nuclear war. Now, of the two, global warming may be the larger question and more important one, but I'm not going to be very enthusiastic about an administration that's running towards war and saying that, well, once we take care of that, we'll do something about global warming. That's not quite the position, but I'm saying there's an immediacy to the question of war that really is important. And that's the matter that is being obfuscated by the Democrats because they want to continue the belligerent policies of the last administration while pretending not to. This election shouldn't let them do that. This election shouldn't give them control of the Congress. I have another point on this from Dr. No. He writes, is the anti-war movement getting started up again? And he points out that women are marching on the Pentagon this weekend and advertising their effort at marchonpentagon.com. Cindy Sheehan, whose son Casey was killed in Iraq in 2004 as part of the invasion of Iraq, is organizing this effort and is interviewed on that site. You can hear Cindy Sheehan's account of what this march is about. Sheehan points out that the wars are bipartisan, no question about that. The women's marches up to now were anti-Trump. That's her language, but she's correct. This event is to kick off a nonpartisan movement addressing these wars all over the world, and it is an all-gender affair, so to speak, that tries to defeat the Democrats' invocation of identity politics in order to destroy the anti-war votes in Congress, as they've done in regard to the race I was talking about a moment ago in Massachusetts. The march is this Sunday, October 21st, 11 a.m. at the Pentagon. And it'll be interesting to see what comes of it. I'm skeptical, frankly. I don't think it's going to be particularly well attended, but we may be surprised.
Well, let me try this one.
Okay. You're watching news from Neptune, and we're trying things here.
We're trying things. Let me try something
David's
else.
being very trying.
I mean, again, I don't take this voting thing all that seriously, but okay, fine. As you know, both of us, and especially me, have been to Rodney Davis's office over there on Fox Drive many times in the past, however, what it is, 4, 6, 8, 10 years.
Why especially you?
Well, okay, we've both been over there.
Okay,
I think I've been over there a couple times when you weren't there, and maybe you've been there when I wasn't there. Okay, whatever. But
now that I think is literally unimportant.
Unimportant. That's not important. Which one of us spent more time at Rodney Davis's office?
No, I'm going to Rodney's office is unimportant.
Yeah. And we go to Rodney's office usually with a few other people from Bob Naiman has been there, and
from just foreign policy around here.
And Aware and so forth. Usually on some relation to Israel-Palestine or war in general or whatever. And of course, nothing ever happens. I mean, Rodney Davis does. He's not our congressperson. He's not. We're not his people. He doesn't care about us.
He's our representative.
Yeah, right. But we know all these Democrats who are trying to get us to vote for Betsy Londrigan, and she presumably will purport to want to be accountable in some way or other to the Democrats, to the liberals, the progressives, the even people like me and you, and not ignore us in such a shameless way as Rodney Davis has been doing for all these years. And in some way, I look forward to the opportunity of shaming not only Betsy Lonergan, but shaming the people who will claim that she will be better when she turns out not to be better. I will feel better about raising my voice to those other people and saying, you want us to be Democrats, you want us to vote for this, you say that something good will come out of it, and are we being any more listened to than we were when Rodney Davis? Well, probably we won't be, but at least we'll be able to make that point with the people who support her, or say that there is some positive reason for putting the Democratic Party in power.
This is Schadenfreude, David. Taking joy in dismay and distress. And, look, I don't think that's a good idea. And by the way, I might want to make it clear here that I don't consider myself progressive or liberal in any of the usual uses of those terms these days. And you don't either. Both of us, I think, would, if pressed, would finally say that our political positions are anarchist. I think that's anarchism is a long discussion, and there's a good reason why the discussion doesn't take place in American politics. Mm-hmm. But as we've pointed out, our program is inspired by Noam Chomsky, who for many years has been talking about anarchism as a way of understanding the political spectrum that runs from left to right. What Chomsky has argued is that the anarchist position, the position not of Antifa and things like that, but rather a position of the far left, if you like, is a criticism of the Marxist-Leninist tradition, but a criticism of the Marxist-Leninist tradition not from the right, not from the conservative side, but from the left, that is, from the democratic side. A democratic socialist, although the term has been completely evacuated of content in recent discussion, a democratic socialist position in the long view of things is the position that is traditionally associated with anarchism. And democratic socialism that is really democratic in the sense that it really does depend upon the will of the majority, is the sort of thing that we're talking about and that we're arguing for. That position surely can't be understood as progressive or liberal in the general uses of those terms. There's an article in the current Counterpunch, a website that we frequently refer to and recommend, not because we agree with everything they publish. They don't even agree with everything they publish. They publish a wide variety of views, more or less on the left. And a recent article discusses the controverted issues of Chomsky's voting recommendations, why they're consistent with a position that might be called anarchist, and what in fact they suggest. To close the circle here, I'm saying that denying the Democrats control of the Congress is the proper anarchist position in this election, given the fact that there is no general choice of positions. We're only offered a couple. One is better than the other.
So you would rather have the Republicans controlling every level of government, from top to bottom.
Come on.
From you want to have them controlling the Congress, the presidency, the Supreme Court, state government, local government.
David, come on. You're sounding like someone like...
Rather than have the Democrats at least have some little bit of leverage, at least in the House, than to have people on the left have maybe some tiny bit of leverage within that little bit of leverage in relation to all the issues that we talk about.
No, I'm simply saying that the chances for war are greater if the Democrats control the Congress than if the Republicans control the Congress because of the peculiar conjunction of politics in this country right now.
But how is it that we don't have war now?
Well, we do have war now. That's
Yeah,
exactly
so
the
you're
point.
saying the chances for war is
The
if there's-
chances of expanding those wars
Okay.
are greater with the Democrats in control of Congress, and that should be resisted.
well,
You're watching news from Neptune. We have things to think about here in terms of the crucial vote that you will cast in November. You may already have cast it with the early voting systems, but in the final analysis, it makes very little difference. What does make a difference is understanding what is going on in politics in America right now, which seems to me in some ways to be obfuscated almost more than in any time in my sentient history of watching American politics. The confusions are very great. They're not an accident, and the whole point is to follow the famous maxim of Thomas Pynchon: if they can get you asking the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about answers. So we're asking the wrong questions when we want to say, well, shouldn't we be voting for the liberals and progressives on those matters? Those aren't the questions. The questions are what this government will do what this government is doing, what this government will continue to do, what this government will do more of unless we stop them. And we do have to stop them.
let me just, as a footnote to that, I didn't have a chance to read the entire article, but there's an article on Counterpunch this morning by a young guy named Nick Pemberton, who has often published over the last year or two there, and it's a discourse on lesser evilism and Chomsky.
Yes, that's the one I was referring to.
And did you read the whole thing, or did you have a chance to sort of mull it over? Or I didn't really have the time to
It's
go
a
through
big
it
argument.
carefully.
It's an argument we should open up.
Yeah,
but,
yeah. Okay, well, that's what I was going to say. But I think he is critical of Chomsky's
Yes.
lesser
Exactly.
evilism, the same lesser evilism with which Chomsky recommended that we vote for Hillary Clinton.
Right.
And I have to say, in retrospect, I mean, I'm still glad that Hillary Clinton didn't get a chance to be president. Given all that's happened since then, I'm still glad.
We shouldn't have given the Democrats control of the presidency,
Yeah.
but you're down with giving the Democrats control of the Congress. Huh?
Oh, whatever. I'm not down. I'm just,
I'm down.
I'm
really
not
down.
I'm not down with Rodney Davis, or
Ooh.
the Republican Party, or the alleged anti-war, proclivities of Donald Trump.
Let me say something about this this article and the arguments about Noam Chomsky's voting recommendations as they've occurred in the last couple of years. Chomsky has said, yes, of course, voting is important. You should take about 5 or 10 minutes to think about it and then choose the lesser evil. Now,
We spent 15 minutes talking about
exactly. We spent more time than it deserves, according to Chomsky, right now.
it. That was my point at the very start.
Lesser evilism, though, is obvious. It's obvious that if you're given two choices, both bad, you should choose the one that's less bad. I mean, that's simply logical. The point is that lesser evilism is a prudential judgment. Which choice is less bad? If I say I intend in the presidential election to vote for the less bad choice, then I have to decide who is the less bad choice, Trump or Clinton. There are a lot of people who agree in principle on what the choice should be, but don't agree at how it should be applied, don't agree which one is the lesser evil. And I think what Chomsky was saying was, of course, the principle is right, and Clinton is the lesser evil. I agree with the first part and disagreed with the second part. I didn't vote for Trump. I voted for someone that actually wanted to be president, Jill Stein. But there are ways in which voting for Jill Stein was not voting for Clinton. And voters for Jill Stein, according to the Clinton campaign, were responsible for her loss. That's nonsense, of course. But the principle divides into those two issues. Of course, the principle is right, but how do you apply it? What is the prudential judgment? And Chomsky came to a prudential judgment that Clinton was the lesser evil, that I disagreed with, and a lot of other people did too, who agreed with his general principle. You agreed with his general principle, I'm sure, and disagreed with his conclusion, right? That Clinton was the lesser evil. Okay. Yeah. So in a sense, we had the same position, and it probably didn't make any difference.
It had to do with what state we live in as well.
Maybe.
And which Chomsky pointed out. He said that people in blue states can safely vote for the Green Party or the Libertarian.
There's a dangerous sidelight here that was bound up with the Green Party and their safe state strategy from a number of years ago, which I think finally doesn't make much sense. But the idea of lesser evilism implies that one is going to make a factual judgment, a prudential judgment on the facts about which is the lesser evil. The principle isn't wrong. The application of it is difficult.
Okay.
I differed with Chomsky on how to apply it.
Okay. So, are we ready to move on to...
I think we're ready to move on. I think the country is ready to move on.
I don't know whether to tackle a big topic or a small... Let me just get this in because it's a little... It's at least something we haven't talked about before.
All right.
Because I've talked about these two other things a little bit before. This week we got the news that Sears is sort of on its death knell.
Yeah, they're going. They filed for bankruptcy.
It's filed for bankruptcy, whatever that means. I mean, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be any more Sears. There apparently will be Sears for a while anyway. But there's a reference to an article on this CEPR, the Center for Economic and Policy Research, which is the Mark Weisbrot Dean Baker Center in Washington, and they have a woman there, Eileen Applebaum, who's done a lot of work critical of the private equity movement in finance and the effect it's had on our economy in this neoliberal era. And I think my sense is that a company like Sears probably would have had difficult anyway competing in a very new sort of retail context, over the last 20, 30, 40 years, that it would have taken a lot of really smart people to figure out how Sears was gonna survive in that context. But it's also worth noting that a primary driver of this is the way it's handled, is the way this problem was handled by the guy and presumably other people who took over Sears in the last 10 or 15 or 20 years. And what Eileen Applebaum writes about the head of Sears, the CEO of Sears, a guy named Lampert, Lampert, she writes, borrowing from the private equity playbook, Lampert loaded Sears up with debt and sold off many of its most valuable assets. In 2015, when it was already obvious that Sears' days as a going concern were numbered, Lampert's hedge fund created a publicly traded real estate investment trust called Seritage Growth Properties. Lampert then had Sears sell 266 Sears and Kmart properties to Seritage for $3 billion. The retail chain then paid the trust a total of $135 million in rent in the first year of the lease agreement for stores it had previously owned, with guaranteed rent hikes in the following years. What made the sale suspect is that Lampert was Sears' chief executive and largest shareholder, and at the same time was chairman of Seritage's board of trustees. So what this basically amounts to is asset stripping. Basically, Sears was able to hang in there because it owned the land on which it operated. It sold the land and then started paying rent to this other company, and that, among many other factors, contributed to the weak financial position that Sears has found itself in recent years. I'm sure there are other aspects of the financial machinations that went on in relation to Sears and the stock market and their lending money and debt and all the stuff that goes on commonly in this neoliberal neoliberal financialized context. But it's worth noting that it wasn't simply a fait accompli, or that we shouldn't necessarily be fatalistic about the end of a company like Sears, and we certainly shouldn't be fatalistic about the effect of that on its workers and their futures and those workers' pensions. All of these things are choices that people have made in this neoliberal context that bring us to this point.
You're suggesting, David, that perhaps the people as a whole should own and democratically control the means of production and distribution, eh?
Well, that would make me Marxist if I.
Good heavens, we wouldn't want to be Marxist.
No, yeah, I mean, in this kind, I mean, this is another example of, it's important to get in the weeds to a certain extent, but yes, you draw back, say, well, how could this be remedied? Well, these choices shouldn't be being made in this particular context. It's more than the shareholders.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I get your point, obviously.
You're watching news from Neptune.
And so, in that spirit, Facebook should be socialized, Amazon should be socialized, Google should be socialized.
Well, interesting things are happening with Facebook, which is getting away from the socialization of the distribution of news, which the tradition gave us, things like the Federal Communications Commission and things like that, because these were public goods. So, in some sense, this is a privatization enterprise. Facebook is a privatization enterprise of information, the same way what you described in Sears was a privatization of distribution mechanisms that Sears was part of. We have only a few minutes left. I'd like to turn to one thing that has dominated the news this week, and that's the events in Saudi Arabia, or the events occasioned by the government of Saudi Arabia, mainly chopping up a reporter, by all accounts, in the embassy, the consulate of Saudi Arabia, on the orders of the effective ruler of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. It's horrifying as this is, of course, to have the chief American client, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the other chief American client, of course, is Israel, being engaged in cutting people up, is not all that unusual. In fact, it was going on across the world by the other chief American client in the response to the demonstrations in Gaza. Meanwhile, the U.S. is busily killing people around the world in at least 8 different conflicts, and some of these, both the KSA, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and Israel are also involved. So sadly, this horrifying spectacle in Turkey was not unique. It was not unique at all, and the politics of it are particularly obscure. This was shown by the fact that the accounts of the murder of Khashoggi, as it seems to have been, given by the New York Times and Washington Post, was quite peculiar. The New York Times and Washington Post both condemned Saudi Arabia and its strongman, its effective leader, Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, as they call him, condemned him strongly for this crime. It's interesting because, of course, the Washington Post and the New York Times are busily supporting similar crimes conducted by other American clients and by the United States itself. So why are they so upset about what's going on, about a casual murder of by a Saudi Arabian death squad in Ankara? The answer seems to be, I suggest, that the CIA has its own candidates for running Saudi Arabia, and that candidate was set aside by Mohammed bin Salman, vicious as he is, and that candidate was another prince of the family by the name of Mohammed bin Nayef. Ben Nayef was set aside by bin Salman, and bin Salman has been running the country flamboyantly since. And the CIA has just seen an opportunity in this event and in this murder to put their favored man back in. Bin Salman has some dangerous enemies in Washington, and those dangerous enemies want to use this horrifying event in order to effect a quiet regime change in Saudi Arabia so that our man is in charge. Think there's something to that?
Maybe, but I mean, don't you think that Thomas Friedman would have still been upset by the death of his friend?
Yeah, well, I'm sure,
regardless of any of all.
I'm
this
sure
stuff.
Tom's loyalties would have been jerked around a bit, but his loyalty to the CIA may take precedence.
Yeah, but it's just, I mean, this is one of, I mean, this is like, this evokes, what Noam Chomsky has always said about Watergate. It wasn't that they did this crime, it's that they did the crime against the wrong people.
Exactly right.
And so Khashoggi, or I guess it's pronounced, from what I've been hearing, it's actually pronounced Khashoggi or whatever. Anyway, is he's known to people who matter. I mean, he's a writer for the Washington Post.
But the New York Times and Washington Post are not upset because he's a writer who matters. I mean, Tom Friedman is a writer who matters too.
Yeah.
If he were offed by his opponents, we would have some viewing with alarm, but it would be conditioned on what the politics were.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to see how this will play out.
I mean, what the peculiar. It's Sherlock Holmes and the dog in the night, in reverse. The dog did nothing at night, but in fact the dogs in this case did do something. The New York Times and the Washington Post screamed bloody murder, literally and figuratively, about the death of Khashoggi. Why? Why they did it, and my answer is they did it because they were working for the CIA as usual on the geopolitics of the matter, and the geopolitics of the matter was that bin Salman, for all his apparent conjunction with the American government, had euchred the CIA man out of the job of running Saudi Arabia. The Washington Post and the New York Times have an extra added attraction in screaming about the Khashoggi murder because Donald Trump seemed to be showing some hesitation to be completely condemnatory of the murder as the Washington Post and the New York Times did. So this is another one in the eye for Trump as well, for the Washington Post and the New York Times.
Yeah, this Saudi dissident, Ali bin Ahmed, I think his name is, or Ali al-Ahmed, was interviewed at length on one of the podcasts I listened to, I think by Ben Norton, and he raised some really interesting issues about what MBS's options really are, in other than just simply following American dictates. That he has options in relation to Turkey, in relation to Russia. And it sort of gave me the idea that things aren't so pat in this alliance, and beyond that, just whether, given the alliance between Israel and Saudi Arabia, that there is a sort of a getting too big for their britches kind of factor there. When you put those two countries together in the Middle East with this alliance and the other Gulf states. It's possible, and with leaders like Netanyahu and bin Salman, you might have this phenomenon where these countries are seen as being sort of having ideas of their own that diverge from the American project.
I think the question is who they are.
Yeah.
There are at least two major factions in the Saudi government, and one faction triumphs with Mohammed bin Salman.
Yeah.
The other faction is still there, and it has backers elsewhere, including in the U.S. But we also have to see what faction in the U.S. is behind things. John Brennan, the ex-CIA head, has a long-standing relationship with Saudi Arabia and with certain forces within Saudi Arabia, forces that may indeed have been opposed to Mohammed bin Salman. The question of who is indeed speaking for America, for the U.S. on these matters, is also not clear. For all this talk of deep state, it's clearly the case that there's a permanent government in Washington that was deeply offended by some of the things that Donald Trump said on his way into the presidency and by his erratic behavior since then. And so they're doing their darndest to see that it's taken care of in a way that satisfies this particular faction in the U.S. There are factions in the U.S. and factions in Saudi Arabia, and their alliances stand behind this particular difficulty, I think.
Okay, well, I'm sure we've completely confused everyone with all of this, but
we've done our best.
Yeah. Okay, so
final comments?
Final comments. I hope we can get around to talking about this neo-fascism thing at some point, because I'd like to know what it is, and everybody seems on board with that, and I'm not quite on board with that, and and I'm just wondering, why, what fascism was, what neo-fascism is, what the future of neo-fascism is. Why should we care about it? That's an ongoing story, and the name Ross Chetty keeps popping up every day in some newspaper article. He's a sociologist at Harvard who talks about poor people, and I think at some point I've wanted to make some comments on his work for the last 2 or 3 weeks, and we seem to be talking about other things. I don't know what those things are.
Put that on the agenda next week.
It's a little wonky, but I think it's important to note. So,
as my high school math teacher used to say, "Good Lord willing, the creek don't rise."
Okay.
We'll be here next week to do that again.
All right.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 42nd week of 2018, a Cutting Up People Alive edition, because that's what the U.S. and its chief allies, the KSA and Israel, do, in spite of the faction fights within all of these criminal conspiracies. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green, produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young and Andrew Scollery. Our thanks to Research Director Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, the third man on News from Neptune. No's notes are posted on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.